Buttons or pads or whatever you want to call them are the foundation of any good tycoon. In this video, I'll show you how to implement this nice sleek looking button that you can unlock with a nice animation and unlock whatever you want. And it'll also make sure that you have enough money to pay for it, and we'll also be setting up the money system and all of that in this video as well. So make sure to watch the previous tycoon video to get caught up on the progress we've made, and like the video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to my channel to stay up to date with the Tycoon series. But without further ado, let's get started. So our button is a component, and so it'll be implemented like our other components we've made so far. So let's take our template, drag it into the workspace, and let's make a new part. So I'm going to create a new part. It's a nice red. That's exactly what I want. And I'm just going to change my ratio real quick and make it a little smaller, a little bigger, and maybe just change it to like a 3x3. There we go. That's a nice looking button. So now I'm going to rename this part to button. Then drag the button into our template. And now we need to tag it because all components need to have a tag. So I'm going to go to my tag editor. If it's not open for you, go to plugins and then tag window. And I'm going to add a new tag called button. I'm going to make sure this part's selected and then click on button. And for right now, it'll only have the button component, but down the line, you'll have buttons that will also be unlockable because you'll unlock a button, you'll buy a button, and then it'll unlock other buttons, which will unlock other things. So it's just like a chain reaction. But initially, you want some buttons that can just be unlocked from the get-go. And that's what this one will be. So we can take it and drag our template back into server storage. Now we can start scripting. First thing I'm going to do is go back to our Tycoon and go down to these two lines down here that we added in the last video. This was just a test, and before I forget, I want to get rid of it just so we don't have any unintended behavior happening. So now let's go into our components, create a new component or new module script, and I'm going to name this module script button. And then you know the drill by now. We're going to rename the module to button, then do button dot underscore underscore index as our meta method, and a function button dot new, which will take in the Tycoon and the part that it's attached to. And then we need to make another function button init, and this will be our initialization. And let's go back up to our button dot new and say local self equals set meta table blank table, and then button, and then return self. Don't forget that. And we're going to need to use our Tycoon in our instance later. So I'm going to say self.tycoon equals Tycoon, and then self.instance equals part. There we go. So this is just a basic setup. I glazed through this pretty quickly. That's because in the previous few videos, I went more in depth. So now in our init, we need to do a few things. So for our button, I want to use a proximity prompt. And the benefit of using a proximity prompt is that it's simple, it's uniform with the rest of Roblox, and it looks a lot sleeker and more professional than just using a touched event. Because traditional Tycoons, you stepped on a button, you touched it with your player character, and it unlocked things. But first of all, you could accidentally step on something by accident, and it just doesn't look that good. But a proximity prompt has a nice little GUI that pops up, and you can see when stuff happens, and that's what we're going to be using. So I'm going to create a function called button create prompt. Now really the better way to do this is to create a proximity prompt, customize it to your liking, then put it in server storage. But for simplicity, I'm just going to create a new one from scratch every time. And then we'll do that by saying local prompt equals instance, if I can spell it right, instance.new proximity prompt. There we go. And then I can say prompt.hold duration equals 0.5. The hold duration is how long you have to hold the key. In our case, the default is E, and I'm going to leave it like that because E is a pretty nice key. And the hold duration is how long you have to hold that key in order to trigger our prompt. Its default is 1. It's a little too long, so I just set it to 0.5. And we can set our prompt.parent equal to the self.instance. And if you want to, you can make the prompt be attached to a part that sort of hovers above the button, because you kind of have to look down to see the prompt. But for my situation, I don't really care. As long as the prompt is visible, I'm fine. And then at the very bottom, we're going to return our prompt. And this is the basic setup. We'll add more a little bit later, but we just want to make sure everything is working. So up in our init, we're going to say self.prompt equals self-create-prompt. Because we're putting this in init because we're actually doing something. We're in the act of creating a new instance and then parenting it to our self.instance. That's why we're leaving it there. And then below that, we want to have an event for self.prompt.triggered. And we'll connect a function which will take an ellipses, so a bunch of parameters that we don't really need to know, and then we'll call another function. So this triggered is called when you hold the key for the whole duration, and when our button is triggered, it's getting pressed. So I'm going to name a function down here, create a new function, button press. And then the proximity prompt will give you an argument of the player who pressed it, which is very convenient. And so now that we have this function defined, I can go up to the triggered connection and just say self press and then send in the ellipses. And keep in mind, we don't really need to do the ellipses. We could just put player, but just in case anything changes, we want to leave this there because this is just forwarding the event down to our function. And don't be worried by the fact that we have an event. Later, we'll destroy the instance. And when we destroy this instance, it will destroy the prompt, which will kill the event connected to it. So we don't have to worry about any memory leaks. So in our press, we can say local ID equals self.instance get attribute ID. And this brings up another point. We need to give our buttons an ID. Because just like in the last video, each unlockable had an unlock ID, our buttons are going to have an ID, which when published will unlock all other unlockables with a matching ID. So let's go into our template in server storage, find our button, scroll the way down in the properties window, and click add attribute. We're going to add an attribute named ID. And our ID for right now is going to match the unlock ID of our test part. So that unlock ID was basic part. If you're not sure, go back to your part and look at the unlock ID. So in my case, it's base part. So our button is base part. So this allows us for the button to unlock multiple unlockables at the same time. Because as long as the unlockable has an unlock ID that matches our button ID, it will get unlocked, which is really nice and really flexible. And so now in our button press function block, we can publish our topic. So we're going to do self.tycoon, publish topic, and the topic will be on the button topic, and we'll send in our ID. So when we publish our button ID to the button topic, all of the unlockables that are listening will check to see if their ID matches and unlock if that's the case. And so once we've published this and once our job is done, we can say self.instance destroy to get rid of the button. And one thing I forgot to do, let me just go back to my button and anchor it. It's kind of something you have to do with Tycoons, but other than that, we should be ready to test. So let's try it out. So I kind of have to walk far. I might have to move my spawn point in just a sec, but that should be pretty easy. We can walk over to our Tycoon. You can see there's an E to interact button, and we can hold E. And once we do that, the test is initialized and our part is spawned. So what just happened? We created a prompt. That's the little E to interact thing we saw. Then we triggered the prompt by holding E for the whole duration. That trigger caused our button to be pressed. We got our ID, which is basic part. And make sure your ID and your unlock IDs match letter for letter because that's very important. They won't work otherwise. And then after we publish it, let's go back to our unlockable. The unlockable sees this and its subscription, and it says, oh, look at that. A button was published, our button ID was published to the button topic. does it match our unlock ID? If so, it unlocks, and that's exactly what it did, and that's perfect. So now let's add some more pizzazz to our button prompt. Let's go back to our button module, and we're going to add a few lines of code, but before we do that, let's go to our button, and let's add a few attributes. So I'm going to add 2 attributes, and each will correspond to a prompt value. So the first one is going to be display, and all of these are strings, and the next one is going to be cost. And the cost will be a number because we need that number to check later how much the player has versus how much it costs. And so I'm going to change my display to basic part. And you'll notice that the display and the ID are very similar. The reason I'm keeping them separate and not having the ID the same as the display is late in development, when you realize you need to change the name of something, you really do not want to change the ID of it because that's just a big hassle and it's not worth it. So I like to keep the values separate. If you really want to keep it simple, you could have your display text the same as your ID, but I would not recommend it. So now in our create prompt, we can say prompt.action text equals self.instance get attribute display, and you can rename the attributes whatever you want. I just thought display is the display text, same as action text. And then for the prompt.object text, we're going to set it to self.instance get attribute cost. What I want to do before that is have a $sign just to make it certain that it's actually money. So I'm going to put a $sign in quotations and then ... to concatenate it with the cost. So now let's try this out. Let's walk over there real quick. You can see it has a 0 and then basic part in front of it. And it does the exact same thing. We didn't change the functionality. So our button works, but right now there's no way to check if the player has enough money to buy a button that has a certain cost. That's because we haven't implemented money at all. So let's do that. I'm going to go to server script service and create a new module script and name this module player manager. This is going to be a pretty run-of-the-mill player manager. You've probably heard of those before or made them before. So I won't explain that much because it's quite simple. So it's just going to be a normal module, not a class or anything, and I just renamed those 2 things. At the very top, we're going to say local players equals game get service players, and then we want a function for the player added, so function player manager dot on player added, and we'll take the player. And then inside here, we want to create the player leader stats. I'm going to make a local function for that just to make it a little more separated. I'm going to name this leader board setup. And this is a very standard leader stats setup in Roblox. I'm just going to say local leader stats equals instance.new folder leader stats. Oh crap. Leader stats.name equals leader stats, and then our money, and I'm just going to name it money because that's the most creative currency I could think of. I'm going to do the local money equals instance.new int value, then money.name is equal to money, money.value is equal to 0 for now, and then money.parent is equal to leader stats. And then we're going to return our leader stats. This just sets up our basic leader stats, and then we can say local leader stats equals leaderboard setup, and then we can set our leader stats dot parent equal to the player. So this will create a leaderboard entry in the top right of the screen, and we'll make it visible to player, and we'll have a money value. Now, right now, this on player added will never be called. So let's fix that. I'm going to make a dedicated function for this called player manager dot start. And you'll only call this once, and all this will do is hook our events to the proper functions. And that'll look like saying players.player added connect player manager.on player added. It looks a lot better than our other event connections just because it's a dot, not a colon, which is great. And so this should work, but we're not requiring it. So let's go to our server, then go to the top, and we're going to say local player manager equals require script dot parent dot player manager. And then right below that, before our player added hook, we could say player manager dot start. And so let's run this. Just make sure everything works. You can see we have money in the top right of our screen. That's exactly what we want. So now that that works, let's add some convenience functions to our player manager. I'm going to say function, or if I can spell that right, function player manager dot get money. And all we're going to do here is return the Leaderstats money value. And we can say local Leaderstats equals player, and the player will be the parameter in the get money function. I missed that, sorry. We're going to say player find first child Leaderstats. And make sure the name is exactly how I put it. You can't really change it, or it won't work. I'm going to say if Leaderstats, then we're going to say local money equals Leaderstats find first child money. And this is just in case the player is in the middle of leaving or something, it doesn't error. And then we're going to say if money exists, then we're going to return money.value. If it doesn't exist, we're going to go to the very bottom and return 0. Just in case it somehow errors, we don't want it to return nil, we just want it to return 0. And then below that we can say player manager set money, and it'll have the player and the value. And so we're just going to make sure the value exists by saying if value then. And then all we can do is copy this entire block up here, paste it down here, and then instead of returning the money.value, we set money.value equal to our value. And these two functions are just to make sure the scripts that use their player manager don't mess up with the leader stats or the money. It just makes it a lot simpler, saves you a lot of lines of code. So now let's go back to our button. And in our button, we can get a few more things. So other than our ID, we can also get the money, or cost, I should say. Cost, which will be equal to self.instance get attribute cost. And this is in our player or button press function block. And then below that, we can say local money equals player manager get money player. But we haven't defined our player manager, so let's do that by going to the top of our script above our button and saying local player manager equals require script dot parent dot player manager. There we go. So we have our player manager, we have the cost, we have the money. So now we need to first make sure the player that activates our button is the player that owns the Tycoon, and then make sure they have enough money to buy it. And if they do, we subtract the money and we publish the topic. So we can do that by saying if player equals or double equals self.tycoon.owner. So if the player is the Tycoon owner and their money is greater than or equal to the cost of the button, then we'll do all this. And then we put an N below that and then tab this in just so it's a little more obvious what it's doing. And then right above our published topic, we're going to say player manager dot set money. We're going to set money of our player to the money minus the cost. So let's say the player has 50 coins or money and the cost is 50. 50 is greater than or equal to 50, and I'll just do 50 minus 50 and I'll leave them with 0 money, which is exactly what we want. So since our button up to this point costs nothing, it shouldn't change the behavior. So let's try it out. And I move the spawn point. So I'm here and I hold this, and you can see the behavior is the same. But if I were to go to our button and then scroll the way down, change the cost to 10, it will not let us unlock it. And I go up to it, it's 10, it won't do anything. But if I were to go into the server by pressing current client up here, it'll switch me to the server. I can go to players, BRIC or whatever your player name is, then money, and I set this to something like 100. I can switch back to the client, and then you can see it's 100 in the top right. We can hold that. It unlocks it, subtracts 10, which is a cost, and gives us 90, which is exactly what we want. So that's it for this video. There is a few edge cases that our player manager needs to handle, as well as we can clean up this area of our server, but we'll do that in the next video. This video has already gone pretty long. So if you enjoyed the video, like it, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more Tycoon series videos. And comment any questions or suggestions in the comments below. The code will be in the description if you want it. And other than that, I hope you have a nice day, and goodbye.